Well, thank you, everybody. We're going to begin rather promptly. So again, I'm Tom Gimacello, and I'm a member of the Audubon board for the Green Mountain Audubon chapter. And tonight we have a very interesting presentation, and I would like to thank our presenter, Gwen Kauser, for agreeing to be our last program for the year. Let me tell you a little bit about Gwen. I'm chuckling because I said, so in your bio, it says that you like to bird by ear. Is that a preference? And she said, well, I got my start in botany and in plants, and she has been with Audubon Vermont since 2005. And she says, one of the things I notice is that the plants stay still and you can see them. So, okay, well, that makes sense. So we're not going to ask her about all of her bird identification skills this evening. She's going to be giving us a program based on native plants and which provide food and shelter for birds and wildlife. And she's going to tell us about all sorts of things that we can do, bird-friendly landscaping. So without further ado, I would like to give the program over to our presenter, Gwen Kauser from Audubon Vermont. Take it away, Gwen.
All right, well, thank you so much to the Green Mountain chapter for hosting me for this event. It's really wonderful to have you all here this evening. And I'm just gonna get started right in. So my name is Gwen Kauser, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm an educator with Audubon Vermont. And I imagine a lot of you are familiar with Audubon, but for those of you who aren't, Audubon's mission is to protect birds and the places that they need here today and tomorrow. And we do that through education, through events like this, through conservation, and through policy work. And Audubon's Plants for Birds program really brings all three of those kind of legs of the stool together for those approaches. Because we can talk about and educate about plants for birds. There's a lot of on-the-ground conservation work that can happen at all different levels in terms of providing habitat for birds. And then around policy, there's some really interesting opportunities to, at all different levels of, to put policy in place to prioritize using native plants. So I just want to give a brief overview of the presentation this evening. I'm going to start off by talking about why native plants matter, and doing that within the context of what are the threats that are out there to birds, and then what are the solutions. Then I'm going to move into the 4 native food groups for birds. Then talk about what birds need in all different seasons, which are food, water, shelter, and nesting locations. And then I'll dive into the Plants for Birds database that Audubon developed and share some resources with you. So because this is a presentation style, I can't see any of you to see if you're raising your hand. So if you have questions throughout the program, I would encourage you to write them in the chat, and I'll stop throughout the program to answer those questions, because I know it's hard to hold them to the end, and I like to be able to interact with folks who are here. So let's see here. Let's start with the big picture. So the really big picture is the flyway. So when Audubon thinks about saving birds, we think about their migratory flyways and protecting birds everywhere that they go throughout their lives. So your yard, as well as your neighborhood and the wider community, are opportunities to fill in the gaps for migratory birds along their flyway. And so this is a really great time to think about that, and when birds are migrating and when they land, what they need. And although our backyards and open spaces are connected, we all are pieces of this larger flyway. The other big picture is the impact of climate change on birds. And in 2019, Audubon came out with their Survival by Degrees climate report. And in that report, what they showed was that nearly 2/3, or 64% of birds in North America, are vulnerable to extinction due to climate change. So that's 389 species, which are moderately or highly vulnerable to climate change. So our action on climate matters, and it matters a lot now. And the other thing that this report found was that mitigation to reduce warming from 3 to 1.5 degrees Celsius will actually benefit 76% of the most vulnerable species of birds, and that 38% of these species would come off of that climate vulnerable list. So if you'd like more details about that report, that's available on climate.audubon.org. And that website is interactive, so you can take a look at birds on a species level basis and look at what the threats are to those birds, as well as what some of those solutions are. Other threats to birds, cats are a huge threat. And the other one right here that's illustrated in this picture are window collisions. But starting with cats, according to the most recent research, free roaming outdoor cats are estimated to kill between 1.3 billion and 3.6 billion birds every year. So there's an opportunity here, and simply by keeping your cats indoors, you can prevent these deaths, and it also keeps your cats healthier as well. In terms of window collisions, you can help prevent those collisions by adding netting in front of your window or applying tape every 2 to 4 inches on your window to birds. And then if you maintain bird feeders, which you can see right out this window, it's safer for the birds to bring those feeders closer to the windows within 2 to 3 feet. So birds may still fly into window, but it wouldn't be with enough force that they would be injured. The other report that came out recently in 2019 was Cornell's report, Decline of the North American Avafana. And what they showed was that 3 billion birds have disappeared since 1970. And one of the most impacted group of birds are the aerial insectivores. And so one of the important steps that you can take is by reducing or eliminating pesticide use on your property, which will be healthier for birds as well as for your family. And then looking at a bigger scale, we're looking at an intact forest here, and habitat loss is really another strong threat to birds. And we've taken over the past century what was once a rich, contiguous landscape of ecologically healthy land full of native plants. And we've transformed much of it into a sterile monoculture of turfcraft lawns and decorative alien plant species. Looking at the whole of the US, 54% of US land has been developed into that suburban urban matrix, with this patchwork of cities and towns with just small fragments of habitat between them. So even when there is that available green space, the typical yard in the US looks like what you see right here. And it doesn't not really provide suitable habitat for birds or most other wildlife. And then looking here, a typical yard, they've shown to be approximately 80% non-native species. I know they're in the wrong words. So restoring native plants means that thinking differently about how we plant our gardens. And so really we're asking our gardens to do a whole lot more. We're actually asking for our gardens to provide soil retention, carbon sequestration, stormwater management, and habitat, and an oasis for birds. So when I think about my garden and what plants I choose, I like to prioritize plants that make me happy or give me food or help out birds in my backyard or in my community park. So plants like serviceberry, birch, goldenrod, and milkweed. Right here is a ruby-throated hummingbird pictured on a cardinal flower. And I wanted to, before I move much further into this talk, I wanted to really give thanks to Douglas Tallamy and the work that he's done in really making the case for how important native plants are, and especially when it comes to caterpillar and insects. So his book, Bringing Nature Home, which is the first book that he wrote, is really about transforming your yard to provide for the basics for birds, which are food, water, shelter, and places to nest. And also consider what birds needs throughout the whole season. So when we're looking at your yard, look at what's missing. Look at what they need to survive. And then maybe I should pause here to check if there's any questions before I shift gears into really diving into those 4 native plant groups for birds.
At this point, we have no questions, Gwen.
Alrighty, I will forge right ahead in that case. So those four plant groups, it's kind of interesting when we're talking about native plants that the number one group here is actually insects. And insects provide protein for birds, which is tremendously important. Second group is the berries and the fruit, and those will offer sugar as well as fat and antioxidants for the birds. Nectar is primarily a source for sugar, and then the nuts and seeds provide protein and fat. And the thing that's unique about them is that those food resources are more available into the fall and in the winter. So our first food group is really the most compelling story for why native plants matter. So take a look here at this chickadee, and this is a Carolina chickadee. And these facts and figures are all from Doug Tallamy. This Carolina chickadee weighs only 0.35 ounces, which is the weight of just 2 nickels or an average sized French fry. During the course of raising a nest of young, a chickadee pair brings between 390 to 570 caterpillars to the nest every single day. And those chickadees feed their young for 16 days before they fledge. So 570 for 16 days is over 9,000 caterpillars. So here we have on the left a native oak tree, and on the right we have a non-native ginkgo. Our native oaks are in the genus Quercus are host to over 550 different species of caterpillars, whereas the ginkgo, a commonly planted ornamental landscaping tree that's native to Asia, supports only 5 species of caterpillars. So if you're a young bird in search of food for your nestlings, that difference is going to be really crucial. Oops, excuse me. And exotic plants really dominate the landscaping industry. And they do that because they're unpalatable for native insects. And that's why they're labeled as pest-free. But unfortunately, birds, when you're thinking about birds and you're thinking about pest-free, that means it's a sterile environment and it's a lot harder to find young food for the young birds. So our current understanding of the importance of insects to native birds and the importance of native plants to our native insects is largely thanks to the pioneering research of entomologist Doug Tallamy. So right here is a caterpillar, and it is so well suited to its environment. It blends right in with the tree leaf right there. And that's testament to the fact that native plants and insects co-evolved over millions of years. Native insects are not adapted to feed on alien plant species, which dominate our traditional urban and suburban landscapes, because those plants are bred to be pest-free. So without the native plants, we don't have the insects, and without the insects, we won't have the birds. So specialization is really the key when it comes to native plants. 90% of insects that eat plants can only eat the plants with which they co-evolved. And exotic plants are just bred to be unpalatable. So when we're looking at the best native trees for caterpillars, there are really some species that really stand out above the others. So this list right here are the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 species that, in terms of their diversity of insects, of caterpillar species that they host. So right up at the top is oak, and there's lots of different species of oak. The willows are really important because they flower so early in the season. So they're an important source of nectar for early pollinators. So they have sort of a doubly good for birds and pollinators. And I'll be getting into the rest of those as we go through the talk. So here's one caterpillar example. This is a caterpillar that uses willow as its host, and willows are host to 456 species of caterpillars. So this caterpillar here is a bird drop mimic. So it doesn't, I mean, it looks like bird droppings. You wouldn't expect that it's a caterpillar. So when it goes through metamorphosis, it becomes a viceroy butterfly, which also mimics the familiar monarch. So quite quite the mimic in both of its phases of its life cycle. So if you want to see viceroys in your garden, then you need to plant those willows. Plants in the genus Prunus, or cherries, are host to 456 species of caterpillars. And cherries are another food that provides two different types of sources of food for the birds. They have the insects, all the caterpillars, as well as the berries. And we have quite a few different species of native cherries in Vermont. Black cherry, which is a understory tree in the forest. And then we have choke cherry and pin cherry, which are more shrub sized. And then sand plum, which is a smaller plant. And when you go to the nursery, you do want to look for those natives and avoid the Japanese cherries, because they, even though they're not a plant that's invasive in the landscape, they're not going to be able to provide the same kind of, be host to those caterpillars that are native to Vermont. So right up here is a birch tree. So river birches are very popular in landscaping, and they're really an all-star plant for birds as well. And they provide those caterpillars, and the birds can also eat the seeds, which are very, very small on the birch and those catkins. Birches are host to over 400 species of caterpillars. And then the other thing that that insects use on birch trees is that the bark that is the so peely bark, they forage for insects in that bark as well. So before I move on to food group number 2, are there any questions from the group around insects?
Again, none yet.
Alrighty. So moving on to the berries and the fruits. So what we have here is a wood thrush, and it is on a flowering dogwood, which is actually not, we're a little bit far north of its range. It's native down in Pennsylvania. So native shrubs and trees that produce fruit with high energy, can produce fruit with very high energy and fat content. And this is particularly important for birds that are building up their fat reserves for their fall migration. A recent study by Susan Smith found that migratory songbirds consume fruits from native plants like this dogwood at a faster rate than fruits from invasive plants, and that the fruits of these native plants are of greater nutritional value to migrating birds than fruits of invasive plants. So when you're taking a look at your landscape and thinking about making changes, really the best first step is to remove invasives. Like I just said, the fruit is not as nutritious as the fruit of native plants. Some fruit, like what's pictured right here, the common buckthorn, is actually harmful to birds. So its Latin name is Rhamnus cathartica. And so that Latin name hints at what it does. Those berries pass right through the digestive tracts of birds, and the birds are worse off than they were before they ate the berries. And it also is a way for the buckthorn to spread its seeds and to establish itself in other places. And then for all of these species that are listed here, the birds will spread those seeds to other places, and then that leads to loss of habitat for native plants. A really great resource for invasive plant identification and management recommendations is vtinvasives.org, which is listed right here. So I encourage you to explore that website. They really have some great resources there. So some fruits are good for, yummy for people as well as for birds. Most berries that we have in Vermont ripen during the summertime, and which is great for food for adult birds while they're feeding their young and they're defending their territories. Blueberries is really the ultimate people-friendly, bird-friendly plant. It's a great larval host for plants, host plant as well. It's in the top 10 for the best caterpillar trees. It's supposed to host to 288 species of caterpillars. Right here is one of my very favorites. I was talking to Clem about this tree. It's in bloom right now outside my window. All of the native species of surfaceberry are hugely popular with birds that eat fruit. And if you can get to the fruit before the birds do, it's delicious. It tastes like a cross between blueberries and grapes. And you'll see down in the corner there, the cedar waxwing. Once those fruits ripen on serviceberry, they'll just come through in droves and strip the tree. So you gotta keep an eye on your fruit before the birds get them all. So my birding by ear. If I could hear you, I would ask if anybody could raise their hand and let me know what bird that is. But I already say it was a wood thrush. It's a wood thrush. So it's really the poster bird for rapidly declining neotropical migrants. They've seen a 55% population decline over the past 50 years. And according to research, 41% of all neotropical migratory songbirds are declining. So the wood thrush migrates at night, and its migration is fueled by their body fat. So when they get exhausted and out of fuel, they stop and to refuel. And if that wood thrush lands in your yard, he's not going to be okay if all you have is privet berries back there. But if you have a yard that has spicebush there and it's loaded with fruit, then he's got it made. Spicebush berries are 50% fat, and that's really a perfect fuel for migrating songbirds. So you need both the female and the male of this plant. And if you do plant those in your yard, plant at least 4 of them so that there can be good pollination for the spicebush. Another great native shrub that has very nutritious berries is the winterberry holly. And these fruits persist into the midwinter, and the fruit are eaten by at least 48 different species of birds. So it's really important for those birds that stick around during the winter on cold winter days to be able to sustain them with that high fat berry throughout the winter. This is another plant that needs both the male and the female to plant. Another great species, and I don't believe I have a picture right here, is Staghorn Sumac. Which is usually a plant that you see naturalized, and those fruit persist over the winter as well. And I've noticed that they tend to persist all the way through the winter. I think the birds don't actually love the taste of it, but when the migratory birds come back in the spring, those fruits are still available, and that's when you see those disappearing. Evergreens also provide fruits. Here we see the eastern red cedar providing berries for the winter. And these berries are also extremely high in fat content. So waxwings love these, bluebirds, robins, thrashers, and goldfinches as well. So in addition to providing food, it also provides cover for birds year round. Before I shift on to the nectar portion of the talk, any questions out there?
We have a question.
We have a question. I was just about to say I should wait until you ask me questions, but yes.
So here's the first question. Okay. How close do you need to plant these bushes so that they can pollinate?
That is a good question. I believe they are insect pollinated. So I'd say, 10, 20 feet is not too far away. The closer together you have them, the easier it'll be for insects to find the other ones. And when I think about planting things, I also like to plant things in groups. So I would recommend, planting them as close together as their space would dictate. So the spicebush doesn't get too big. It's probably maybe 3 or 4 feet in diameter. So go ahead and put them as close together as you can.
I think the question, Gwen, is actually about the male-female, because the way it's written, it's how close do you need to plant these bushes so that they can pollinate, and I'm assuming it's each other. So could you kind of talk to that as well?
Yes, so the male and female of, the male is not going to have any berries, the female will have the berries. And so the insects are going to pollinate, go to the males, find the pollen, bring it to the females. So the closer you can have them together in your garden, the better.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's the only question right now.
Alrighty. So shifting gears to nectar, what we have right here is the cardinal flower, and those red tubular flowers are a classic plant for attracting hummingbirds. And hummingbirds are amazing in their migration story. They make a 500-mile nonstop crossing of the Gulf of Mexico. And nectar is what refuels and builds fat reserves for these birds. So cardinal flower is one of their favorite nectar sources. But not all nectar plants frequented by hummingbirds are red. Jewelweed right here is a late season bloomer, and it blooms from July through September. And it's one of the very few annual native plants, flowering plants that we have in Vermont. What's pictured here is the yellow jewelweed. There's also an orange flowering species. So if you have space in your garden in a moist area, I'd recommend that you plant a big patch of jewelweed. It's really great for those hummingbirds to fuel up for their migration in the fall. Other great nectar plants for hummingbirds in their fall migration are also turtlehead and blazing star. And what we have here is Columbine, and which is blooming in the spring. So early blooming wildflowers will provide important nutrition for hummingbirds after they come north. So Columbine blooms in April and May. And thinking about other pollinators beyond hummingbirds. So I neglected to mention hummingbirds actually pollinate 160 different species of native plants in North America. And when you're thinking about planting and the spacing of plants for hummingbirds in your garden, you want to space them out far because hummingbirds can be territorial. So you don't want a single hummingbird to be able to kind of control all of the territory. So if you space them out, then more hummingbirds will be able to utilize that resource. And then looking at other pollinators that providing nectar for birds as well as pollinators, purple coneflower, New England aster, Joe Pye weed, and orange milkweed are all great choices in the garden when you're thinking about providing for pollinators. Any questions before we move on to our fourth group, the nuts and the seeds?
Not at the moment.
Alrighty. The blue jay. So the blue jay is a great example of a bird that utilizes nuts, and they stash their acorns so that they can have a cache of food to last until the next spring. And in this photograph here, it looks like this blue jay only has one acorn in its beak, but they're actually capable of carrying 5 acorns all at once in their throat. And this bird is really an ecological force in the landscape. They will cache between 3,000 to 5,000 acorns in one fall season. They also gather and hide beech nuts, hazelnuts, and hickory nuts. And of course, those seeds that they don't consume or they don't find again, those help to reforest, grow new plants in the forest. So pines, what's pictured here is a red pine. And in addition to being a great caterpillar host plant, pines are also a good source of nuts. And they have their seeds right at the base of each of those scales in the pine cone. A group of birds that is very closely tied to those pines are the crossbills. And they get their name from the crossed beaks, which are uniquely adapted to pry open the scales on the cones to get at those protein-rich pine nuts. So when you are choosing insect host tree species, consider some nuts and seeds. And some great choices when you're thinking about seeds, if you have space in your garden for trees, American beech is an excellent choice. Oak is really right at the top, because we talked about earlier in the talk about insects and the diversity of caterpillar species that they host. And then they also provide the nuts throughout the winter. Shagbark and bitternut hickory are good choices. If you have less space, the American and beaked hazelnut are a shrub species. American and slippery elm are really good choices. They actually, they will succumb to Dutch elm disease, but they are able to grow big enough to be able to produce seed and provide food for birds in the landscape. American hornbeam is a great seed producing fruit. ash species, we are actually still planting those. Emerald ash borer clearly is coming in and decimating their population, but there could be some resistant ones. So keeping those trees out in the landscape to see what will happen over time is a good idea. And then maple species and birch species are all great sources for seeds and nuts. And then thinking about smaller plants, thinking about flowers and perennials, purple coneflower is a popular landscaping plant. It's really cherished by the American goldfinch, and you can keep that goldfinch in your yard by not deadheading things in the fall. If you let your flowers go to seed, then those finches will really thank you. And those seeds can last throughout the winter into March, all the way. And sometimes you see them out there and with the seeds on the snow. And they can even provide food for early spring migratory birds. So you want to have a whole cascade of flowers that are going to produce seeds for finches and sparrows that will provide food throughout the winter. Another good example of seeds here, we see the palm warbler on goldenrod on the left, and then on the right is little blue stem. And both of these plants will have seeds from October all the way through March. So looking at the structure of your garden, the way I like to think about it is to really try to have a structural diversity in your landscape. And I use the forest to inspire my thinking about the layers in the garden. So the overstory is about those canopy trees in the forest. The mid-story in your garden is going to be provided by small trees and shrubs. And then in the understory, you're going to have a wide array of choices around grasses and broadleaf herbaceous plants. And the more diversity you have in those layers, the more birds can survive and find different food sources in those spaces as well as shelter. So in addition to the food and habitat provided by native plants, the next important thing that you can provide for birds is water. Clear, fresh drinking water and for bathing is especially important for birds in the winter. There are lots of creative ways to provide for this through bird baths, shallow troughs, rock-lined stream beds, cascading waterfalls or ponds. And it doesn't even take a whole lot. Even just a trickle of water can really attract dozens of bird species to your yards. So when you're thinking about shelter and nesting sites, evergreens are a really great source of those things throughout the whole year. They're going to provide shelter from cold as well as cover from predators, especially in the winter. And what we're looking at here is a rhododendron, some native conifers in Vermont. The eastern red cedar also has the berries there that are so high in fat. The juniper is a great choice for a native conifer. For pine species, we have the eastern white pine, as well as the red pine and the pitch pine. And then if you're looking at thinking about a hedge, northern white cedar is a really great choice as well. So thinking about shelter, it doesn't really need to be that complicated. When you do your pruning, you can make a pile somewhere in your yard, maybe in a back corner. And when you're making this brush pile, think about it being messy. You want to look at it and think, are the branches far enough apart that a bird could fly in there quickly, but it's tight enough that hawks wouldn't be able to sneak in there. Looking at this pile, are there good perches for birds in there? Is the structure of it thick enough to provide some structure, but still leave room for the birds? Ooh, white-throated sparrows. Right now, I don't know the rest of you, but right now in Burlington, my yard, the white-throated sparrows are migrating through. I don't see them the rest of the summer, but for a few weeks right here in Burlington, they are just all over my backyard. And that's because I don't do a lot of cleanup in my yard. So there's a lot of leaf litter out there. And so these birds that are coming through spend a lot of time foraging in that leaf litter. And so it cuts down on raking, but the caterpillars that have been on the leaves are going to overwinter in that leaf litter, and there's other insects as well. So let's see here.
Gwen, we do have a question before
questions,
we
excellent.
move on.
Go right
And
ahead.
here's the question.
Mhm.
It is, do you know if pin oak is a quote good unquote oak, or is it more of an ornamental tree?
Pin oak is not a native oak in Vermont. But it is able to survive up here as climate change is making our winters less severe. So given the choice, I would choose a native oak. There's quite a few to choose from over pin oak. It is native down like in Pennsylvania and further south, but so things like red oak, white oak, swamp white oak, bur oak, chestnut oak, those are all native oak species. So there's a lot to choose from. There might be harder to find in the nursery, but that's a good question. I would definitely choose a different oak over the pin oak.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions out there?
Not yet.
All righty. So thinking about trees, if you have a big enough space in your yard that you can safely leave dead and dying trees up, snags provide tremendous habitat for birds to nest, as well as for birds to forage for the insects that have made the snags. And really, those when we're building nest boxes, it's mimicking those holes that the birds would use to utilize in those snags for their nesting sites. So if you don't have space in your yard for leaving snags up, building a birdhouse is a great option. And I was just noticing in my notes here, it says that more than 1/4 of cavity nesters are in decline, which makes a lot of sense because people are taking down those snags, or they're not leaving those up there. So having bird houses that have holes of different size help. And here, what you'll see on the left is a bluebird sized hole next to a nuthatch or chickadee sized hole box right there. So when you're thinking about native plants, you don't have to have a huge yard to make a big impact. So here's a very small garden plot in Baltimore, Maryland. And this is near Patterson Park Audubon Center. And 50% of the patio in this plot is in native plants. And you just need to make a commitment to changing as much as you can over to those native plants. So looking at how you think maybe 1 yard can't make a difference, but when you add them all together, the impact can really be huge. So this is a map right here of over 3,000 registered habitat properties in Portland through Portland Audubon's Backyard Habitat Certification Program. So you can see how, as people are committing to making a difference with native plants in the yard, it can really, as a bird with a bird's eye view of this, it has an impact. So doing all those things together, it doesn't have to happen all at once, but taking all these things into consideration as you're planning your garden is going to make a big difference for the birds.
Let me pop in a question, if I may.
Absolutely.
It's a question about trees. What about black locust? There are a lot in Burlington, and they're at the edge of their range. Are they useful to birds?
They are useful to pollinators, which makes them useful to birds. So when they blossom coming up here in the late spring, there's a huge number of pollinators that come to the black locusts. And so birds, the aerial insectivores in particular, can go ahead and use those. But then the pods don't provide food for the birds. And it's a good question about whether, because we are at the edge of their range, if the insects are able to be there with them. I know that the black locusts were planted by colonists who planted them because of their rot resistance for fence posts. So you'll often see huge stands of them because they spread by underground runners. And so they persist in the landscape and spread. So in terms of if you were to choose a tree for your garden, that wouldn't be my first choice because of so many other good choices that are out there, but they're certainly not harmful in the landscape for birds. And like I said, the blossoms and the aerial insectivores are, providing some ecological value.
Thank you.
And I would also think that, how the bark is so rough that there would be a lot of good places for birds to forage in the bark as well. So thinking about being bird friendly is also, when you're planting, it's also being climate friendly. Planting native plants directly reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Planting more plants can increase carbon storage, and it helps resiliency because the more diversity of plant species we have out there, the more resources are available to birds, and especially as birds expand their range. Vermont is going to be a place where birds are going to be moving into. So the more options they have, the better off they're going to be. And just wanted to cite that Audubon study again around climate change. So when you're thinking about climate action, this is what it looks like, the report that's specific to by bird species, if you go to our website. So if you're thinking about climate action, right here are 5 actions that will really make a difference in terms of mitigating climate change. One of the most important things you can do is reduce the use of energy at home. And then on the flip side, or the more activist side of things, would be to support energy saving policies that reduce the demand for electricity. A second action would be to expand consumer-driven clean energy development, and which will also help grow jobs in our communities. A third climate action will be to reduce the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere. Advocating for natural solutions in maintaining healthy carbon storing forests is something that's really you're going to be seeing a lot more of that coming up in terms of addressing climate change. Those natural solutions and native plants are a great answer for doing what we can around impacting climate change. And then really being in touch with your elected officials to make sure that they know where you stand on climate, and to make sure they know where you stand around conservation. So to make our landscape more climate resilient, using native plants in our homes and communities, and managing forest land with birds in mind can make a big difference. So moving on to resources here. Any questions before we shift gears?
We are ready to shift.
All right. So shifting on to our native plants database. So this is a database that was developed by Audubon. They helped them out with this, and it's really powerful. You just go to the native plants database, which is audubon.org/plants4birds. And when you get there, you'll enter your email address and your zip code, and that will generate a list of plants that is specific, native plants that are specific to exactly where you live. When you get there, it's going to generate plants which you can then sort by plant type. So you can see here, goes from trees to shrubs to succulents, evergreen trees, vines, annuals, and perennials. Another interesting feature here is that you can really think about the resources that are in your garden that they're looking to provide, that are missing from your garden for birds. So that might be nectar, it might be fruit. You might want to look for plants that are specifically attractive for butterflies or caterpillars, and then looking at providing nuts and seeds as well. And because it's Audubon resource, it is also, you can search the database if you want to attract a particular type of bird to your yard. That's an option as well. Another resource that's part of this database is the local resources tab right here. It will point you to where you can buy native plants near you. And right here is a list, and it goes on longer than the screenshot of this page. And that list does get updated. So if you know of places that have moved into providing native plants, we'd be happy to hear about those and add them to that database. There's also, I also recently put a page on the Audubon Vermont website that has all of these resources all in one place, so you don't have to navigate all the way through the database to find those local nurseries. And I can pop that in the chat at the end here. There's page 2 of the local nurseries that specialize in native plants. Another great resource is a project that's happening in Maine called the Wild Seed Project. And this was started by Heather McCargo. And she has quite a few blog posts on here and about how to grow your own native plants from seed. So if you're really committed to being hyper local to exactly where you're at, this is a wonderful resource. Another resource when you're thinking about having an impact and spreading the word is a Plants for Birds sign. So this is from Audubon. You can put this in the garden. It'll help spark conversations in your neighborhood about why are you planting native plants? You know, why do you manage your garden in this way? So that's I'll add that in the chat as well with a link to where you can get a Plants for Birds sign. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can share some resources.
And while you are doing that, one of our participants from Jericho, Bernie Paquette, I have given the information. I put it in the chat. It's a spreadsheet of 1,458 plants that are native to Vermont that you can access. So there is a web link to that plant database, and I thought it would be of interest to everybody.
Oh, absolutely.
There is another question which has come in, and it says, what are neonicotinoids and do they harm birds?
Yes, so neonicotinoids, let's see, did not prepare for this question, but neonicotinoids are particularly impact insects, and because of their impact on insect populations, they have an effect on birds as well. So it's not, the pesticides themselves are not harming the birds, it's the impact of those pesticides on the insect populations that are a problem.
This is a comment and a question. I will read it, and you can choose what you'd like to do with it. And a new message has come in. There was a slide on recommended approaches to address climate change, and it said to reduce the use of electricity. Why just reduce the use of electricity as carbon strategy? What about fossil fuels used for transportation and heating?
Absolutely, I would totally concur with that. So moving away from our reliance on fossil fuels is essential to addressing climate change. And in Vermont, transportation is a huge issue, and it's a huge use of fossil fuels. So anything that we can do to move away from that reliance, all the better. So thank you very much for that comment.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, it is 7:20, and again, we have some, for everybody who is listening, there are some, make sure to look at the chat because there are some resources that have been put in there. One resource that I know that we appreciate this evening is Gwen Kauser. Gwen, I thought this was a very informative, extremely well presented presentation. And I think it's going to motivate many people to take a look at the space around their dwelling and also think a little wider in their community and the planet. So on behalf of the program committee of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank all those who attended tonight. We had about 25 participants. And I'd like to wish everybody good weather, good birding, good plants, and good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.